I will start with Professor Lampton's paper, which I actually have very little to say, except to say it's always good to hear good news. I love to hear optimistic prognostications, except that I'm basically a pessimist. So I am going to say what you already know, and that is that there are limitations to polling data, and that these are skewed by certain events. For example, I noticed that one of the polls comes from October 2012. That would be just a few weeks after Japan announced the nationalization of those islands, some of those islands, because to be fair, the Japanese government already owned some of the islands, and others had been leased previously, and taxes paid to the Japanese government, but nonetheless, it had a bad effect in China. I notice also that most of your polling data is from 2012 and 2013, and it would be more meaningful to do a time series. And there, I think the Japanese Prime Minister's office has a way back. The Japanese love to take polls, as you know, and so they've got a time series going way back that would be less affected by the events of the moment. And I also noticed, and I saw you writing it down, that your polling data and Tom's disagree with each other on a number of items, so it'd be fun to check those out. And then we all know that even though polling in China has gotten a lot better and people have gotten a lot more confident in answering questions than they used to be, they're still skewed to a large extent by a certain number of people's worrying that their answers are not really anonymous and there may be problems later, which doesn't occur in the United States and other countries there. I am fascinated, and this is a point I want to make, that your assessment of what impact polling data have on decision makers. And my feeling is not a whole lot, definitely not in the United States. I've never noticed Washington listening. And as my introduction said, I used to work for the Chief of Naval Operations, and the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, a very wise man, Admiral Lawrence, once described Washington as a small island surrounded by a sea of reality, and which kind of fits in with what you said at the beginning, Mike. And another question I had was, what happens when these younger people you're polling get older? Yeah. And just to give you an example, it's an old saw of American politics that younger people are very liberal, and as they grow older and they pay taxes, they become a lot more conservative. And then there was this saying about the Soviet Union, oh, it's so sad, all you see are older people in churches, and the assumption there is religion is going to die out. And I'm thinking of that in my own church, where almost everybody is older. And it's not so much that religion is dying out as that they're so busy, feeding the kids on Sunday morning and getting them off to their activities. They don't have time for church, but they haven't abandoned religion. So that's something to think about. And with regard to Iran, people have a less favorable view of Iran than the United States. And again, what about the decision makers? They seem happier to be friends with Iran on many scores. So anyway, that's my skepticism about polls, I guess. With regard to Tom, a very impressive job of culling and bringing together commentary on the United States. I would call your attention to the skepticism, which perhaps you didn't mean, but what comes across in your chapter is the skepticism in the way you report the articles. And so this, for example, that leads directly to your conclusion that narratives of suspicion, this is an exact quote, narratives of suspicion regarding Chinese ambitions lack an attempt to offer parallel arguments about the expansion of U.S. forces in the region. And your paper was unpaginated, so I'm going to have to, yeah, it was. And I'm going to have to direct you to spaces between footnotes as a result. And so, for example, between footnotes 41 and 42, where you say the media suggests that China is the aggressor, why not? If we're talking about X and Y here, if X is in control of some entity, in this case the islands, and Y, rightly or wrongly, says it's ours and we're going to make certain moves toward them, that's the aggressor. That's not skewed reporting. And around footnote 37, you say Vietnam is said to be, India is said to be. This is about the maps and the passports. And then Captain Fennell is said to say such and such. That's what I mean about skepticism. It sounds as if you don't believe these things, when in fact we have pictures of the overstamped passports, pictures of the maps, and I have a video. If you disbelieve Captain Fennell said that, I've got a video, a link to send you. He said it. Okay. Now, let's see. One source you should be skeptical of is the one that's footnote 112, Justin Logan, and that is the U.S. attempt to infantilize Japan. Egad. My God. This is the United States at the end of World War II, not just us, but prodded by our allies in the war, was at great pains to see that Japan never again became a militaristic nation. So it wrote Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. And come along 1950, the Korean War starts, and we think, oops, maybe we better make a mistake. And we have been pushing Japan off and on ever since then to change its stance. And naturally, since Japan was protected under our nuclear umbrella and we're getting aid, we were giving them aid, they didn't have to pay for their own defense, they kept saying, oh, well, you really convinced us. And I'm sorry, I'm a New Yorker, and they only gave me 10 minutes, and I've got to talk even faster because I've got a lot to say. So there is even a Japanese term for it, gaiatsu, foreign pressure. And there are a lot of other Japanese terms for it, but I don't have time. Okay, now, around footnote 96, Hegel addressed the Diaoyu Senkaku only after the Japanese defense minister raised the topic. Again, Jesus Christ, I mean, really. The Japanese newspapers were, the whole 3 weeks before the thing, said he's going to get the commitment from Hegel, and we've got it nailed. So that was not something off the top of Hegel's head there. By the way, Hegel that was not the first time he said the U.S. commitment. And again, I don't have time to deal with it. We can go on to it later. Now, in your conclusion, you say that China is depicted as a reckless actor. The quotes you have do not mention the word reckless. I follow this very carefully. The normal terms used are assertive, increasingly aggressive, and occasionally muscular, not reckless. And again, I didn't realize that this was part of a larger study in which you have Chinese and Japanese, but you really have to compare those. And seen from a different perspective, the United States is a hegemon. China would not disagree with that. And being a hegemon is a tough job. And it sees itself perhaps as a hegemon that's being pushed out of Asia. And whether you think that's a good thing or not, Hillary Clinton in 2010 said the United States has legitimate concerns with what happens in the Pacific and wants things settled by Pacific small p methods. And The Chinese minister got very upset about that and stormed out of the meeting. This was in Hanoi. Panetta has said for a number of times the U.S. is a Pacific capital P nation. That was reiterated in the so-called shirt sleeve, anything but meeting at Sunnylands. Let me quote with something from today's New York Wall Street Journal by Jim Woolsey, somebody I have worked with before. And he says, the U.S. is not even leading from behind, it's rather stumbling along behind. Being a hegemon, a nation has to have the will to do it. It's not cheap. This is me, not Woolsey. In terms of blood and treasure and your ego, because you get a lot of criticism being a hegemon. And from the nations it hegemonizes, that's not a word in the dictionary. The United States is reluctant on all counts. We have budget problems internally. We have reluctant allies because they rely on China for large parts of their prosperity, and yet they want the United States to defend their security. The Obama pivot, I think, was very dangerous because we will never extricate ourselves from the Middle East. We won't. And for Obama to announce this without having the commitment behind him to do it was a big mistake and very dangerous. And I was addressing the Reserve Officers Association in DC 2 weeks ago, and I said, this is the exact opposite of Teddy Roosevelt advice to speak softly but carry a big stick. What we're doing here is carrying a big stick. Is speaking tough, and while the stick is made of velvet and it crumbles very easily. Thank you for your attention.